So welcome back. Thank you, Jen, for being here. I understand that another area of your interest is foreign aid, considering your experience on the ground. But I feel like the current political landscape is pushing us to rethink development, especially development aid. What issues can you identify that has gotten us here?
How long has U.S. assistance been in Guatemala?
For too long.
And I think that's part of the challenge, right? I think that there are very well-intentioned people trying to solve these problems. And in the United States, where we saw USAID ended, there was a perception, at least by the Trump administration. I don't want to say, I think I share part of the critique, but I don't necessarily agree with the solution, right? It's just to get rid of USAID in 1 second. But the sense that there was politicization of aid, and that the politics of aid was counterproductive to U.S. foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And I think that was sort of the biggest criticism that I saw, at least Secretary of State Marco Rubio offer, was that often aid and NGOs were going in one direction politically, and that was undermining U.S. foreign policy. And I do think that there's some, that was a legitimate concern, especially because aid really strayed from its core work in health, education, infrastructure, and got very involved in political issues right after the end of the Cold War, and that was with democracy promotion. And so I think that reform was really targeted at ending democracy promotion, not because that the U.S. didn't care about democracy, although people would probably argue with me about that, but because often the political objectives of the aid was coming from the Agency for International Development and not coming from the State Department. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the big tensions that we saw. And, working in that system, I did see that happen, not unfrequently. Whereas aid wanted to go one way and was implementing projects that were doing something, and the State Department was doing something else. And it wasn't always intentional. I think sometimes USAID, works on a project cycle. So you're doing things on like 3-4 year cycles with project plans, and then US policy changes very quickly. Yeah. And doesn't have the same kind of agility. So I think sometimes that explained it. You have a change of administration, you have programs that are working, that are doing something else that may be at odds with whoever is in power. Some people argue that aid shouldn't be political. Aid should just be focused on these pure humanitarian crises. I wish that were true, but when you're dealing with governments giving out money, of course it's going to focus on, and I think it should focus on, the interests of those countries. And to say that a country doesn't have any interest in doing this kind of is contradictory to the desires of most taxpayers.
Yeah. So from what I'm hearing is that these projects of foreign aid they are not taking into consideration the needs of the beneficiaries. They're just maybe analyzing the ground, their communities, and saying, oh, you need this and this and this, and maybe that's not their needs. They're just imposing them. So what is the effect of that, of not considering the community?
So I think, every aid, I want to give some credit to, my colleagues who are working in this area. I think they were very committed to solving problems, and I think in their minds that they were actually fulfilling the needs. It's just hard to identify who is the beneficiary. If you're dealing with ministries, they're going to tell you that the needs are one thing, and typically aid does deal with the beneficiary is building the capacity of state institutions, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because even the most libertarian person would recognize a need for certain public goods and services. So but there was often a disconnect, that it was just easy to keep doing the same thing that you'd been doing over and over and over again, or take one project design from another place and impose it in a different community. That happened quite often. And then I think, the bigger challenge is that when you've seen aid projects exist for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, you have to wonder, I always think of NGOs and aid as organizations that their primary objective should be to work themselves out of a job, right? And that you're a gap filler and you exist for a period of time to help people solve a problem, but your objective and your most significant marker of success should be how quickly you left. Yeah. And we saw a lot of, we talk in public choice theory about a lot of very perverse incentives that organizations really sought to stick around forever, regardless of whether their mission was really a match for the needs of that society.
Yeah, and from what I'm seeing is that instead of being aid workers, they become rent seekers, and they are just looking for ways to stay as long as they can in the bureaucracy they're in. And yeah, I feel like that's a good insight, because people don't see it like that. They think that as long as we can have this project running in this country, so that means it's a success for the organization.
And I think there's rent seeking on two sides of this. I think, look, I have a lot of friends who've lost jobs because of this, and they're incredible people and very talented people. And this was an industry that they worked in. And I remember talking to some colleagues recently who I brought together a group of people, some people who were working in like fintech and alternative forms of development, and some people who had worked at USAID. And the fintech people were talking about how, these are new ways to do some of the things that you were doing. And the development people kept saying, that's not development. That's not development. What you're talking about isn't development. Because it didn't look like what they did, because they associate projects with development. But actually, aid maybe is not development, right? If we look at the broad panoply of history, the role of foreign aid in facilitating development, I think there are a lot of questions. Some places it's played a positive role, other places not so much. But if we look at, the aid budget in, USAID's budget in Guatemala, I looked recently, was like around $400 million. Remittances,
I think over 19.8 something
billion. So in the large scheme of things, remittances are much more impactful for development. Industrial policy, much more impactful for development. Tax policy, right? So, when people begin to think that micro level health projects is development, it's not development, that's something else. So we have to really think about, maybe it contributes to development. But I think there has been a lot of confusion about really what is the purpose of foreign aid.
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge about rethinking about foreign aid and development, because some people argue that we should stop aid completely and get rid of it. But from my perspective, I don't think that's the solution. We just need to think of ways of making aid productive. And how do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I think, a lot of people talk about getting rid of foreign aid, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we want it to be. So regardless of how someone might feel about getting rid of aid is going to be here, and it's not going anywhere. And even in the United States, Donald Trump got rid of USAID, but it's coming back in new carnations, and it's coming back under the State Department. And we have to deal with the world as it is. And I think the question is, can it be made more effective and more responsive to communities, and really incorporate human agency more? And that is very hard to do. As donors, anytime you receive funding from anyone, how do you preserve your agency? And this is a question for anybody who receives money, whether you're a research organization that receives a grant, right? You see donors have different priorities, and people pivot to where the funding sources are, but that may not actually yield development.
Yeah. And I think the topic of foreign aid is very interesting, and I want to learn a little bit more about how there's a connection to informal institutions, and especially concepts such as democracy and civil society, because I think that has had an effect on those type of concepts. So we're gonna discuss a little bit more later. So thank you, Jen.
Sure, thank you.